we're already kicking off, right? So we're even live on YouTube now. So then we really have to start. So very happy to announce you here is already the 4th episodes of FSR Insights, part of the online event series at Florence School of Regulation. In Insights, we always start from researchers at the school. And in this case, it's Valerie and Tim. And I should be very thankful to them because they helped produce this book here that we just published. And both of them today will give a short intro to a chapter, leading to an open issue that we will then discuss with the 2 academics we have invited for this event. And you already know Tim and Valerie, right? They're part of the school for a few years now, so most of our audience knows them. So I spend a bit more time introducing Anthony and Line. So very happy that both of them are here. What do you have to know about Anthony? Well, he started his career in Athens, and then he went across the Atlantic to Berkeley. So he went from South Europe to the south of the US, and he had fun there because he stayed quite a while. He even for a postdoc was there, and then he became a professor coming back to Europe at the university in Louvain. And you could say that Line did a bit of the opposite, right? She started in the north of Europe, in Oslo. She did a detour via Zurich. Maybe there was no direct flight from Oslo to Wisconsin-Madison. So she went through Zurich. She stayed a bit longer than a transit would normally take because she did her PhD there. And now she's across the Atlantic in Wisconsin. And both of them are young professors. So I still consider myself as a young professor, but they're even younger than me a few years. So very happy to have both of them here. They have a mixed background of operations, research, you could say, and engineering. And that also allows us to have a bit of a technical discussion today on electricity markets. And we'll kick off with Tim, who will talk about balancing markets, one of the chapters in the book. And then we'll have Valerie that will introduce us to a topic on system operation. And now, Tim, you could launch the slides.
Okay.
Because before jumping into the discussion, we of course have to show you a nice picture of the book. You saw that on the first slide.
This one, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, Tim, I mean, and also if you want to engage during the discussion here with us on social media, there is 2 hashtags. We have a hashtag for the book and the course that is related to the book. And of course, a hashtag of this event series, FSR Insights. Then I just wanted to share this picture here. Because it very nicely shows a bit also that a book is more than just some latest academic insights. What is nice about a book is that you can synthesize and you can look back and take a perspective on everything that happened. And that's really what we did in this book, because if you look back at the last 20 or even more than 20 years, of course, everybody knows that we have had waves of legislation that really reformed electricity markets all the way from the first energy package to the most recent clean energy package. But on the bottom, I think these are stories that are worth to be told equally, because you could say that, besides very technical discussions on electricity markets among us as experts, sometimes electricity markets reach a more general audience because something goes wrong or something happens. And these have, if you look back now, have been key moments in the history of electricity markets that brought certain things to attention of a larger audience and also build the political willingness to actually do the next reform. And this is also what is nice about the book, that we took stock of all these elements, from cruise ship incidents to solar eclipse, software bugs, or delayed clocks. So I hope some of you will enjoy reading that. And now I'm handing the floor to Tim. Tim, please take us to the first open issue to discuss.
Okay, so thank you, Leo. So we could not present the whole book in 1 hour session, so we had to pick out some elements of it, and one of that is a chapter on balancing. So first of all, what is balancing all about? So I think most of us know that in real time, the physics don't lie, and in a power system, supply has to equal demand. Now you can imagine that a generator does not exactly produce what it's planning to produce in real time, or a demand does not exactly consume what is forecasted to consume. So in real time, there will be always a bit of a mismatch between supply and demand. So therefore, and if that mismatch is not solved, then the frequency will start deviating from the reference, being 50 hertz in Europe or 60 hertz in the US, and then all kind of bad things can happen, ending up in a brownout and a blackout. So somebody has to intervene in real time in order to make sure that supply equals demand. And this is what balancing is all about. So before the liberalization and in the beginning of the liberalization, this was really, I would say, it a mechanism, a balancing mechanism. While today we have balancing markets. And in the book, we describe how we went from a mechanism into something which looks more as a market. So this slide actually shows when we opened the balancing markets in the beginning, how much of a concentration there was in terms of players. I mean, already in the wholesale market, there was a strong concentration of, let's say, former national champions or incumbents who were then competing. But in balancing, that was even worse, because you can imagine that not everybody can compete in offering balancing services, being increasing or decreasing your energy most of the time. In that days were production. Today you have also demand, but in those times it was mostly generation who can then compete in order to offer these services. So you can see this concentration, which was really a sort of a concern. So therefore, at European level, there was a lot of effort, and then later also at national level, effort being put in order to open these markets for more players, to streamline the rules, to make this mechanism really into a market, and then in order to create more and more entry and competition. So there was not only let's say, more and more players within one country, there was also a big European effort in order to create competition for balancing across different countries. So what you can see on this slide is that we began, I think it was 2015, 16, maybe 14, experimenting with pilots of 2 countries or 2 TSOs cooperating in terms of the procurement of balancing. And then out of these pilots, actually platforms were formalized. And the most important, I would say, European legislation in that respect is the European Balancing Guideline. In the EBGL, as expert would call it, it's really set out how these balancing platforms have to be set up. You can see that there are 4. There's imbalanced netting. There is one for AFRR, MFRR, and RR. So you can imagine that it was a big deal in order to streamline all these market rules to a certain extent between different countries, to then integrate them in order to allow for cross-border balancing energy procurement. So in order to allow for more competition to provide these balancing energy. Now, this is currently ongoing, and this, I think, the methodologies have been agreed upon with Acer, but now they've been disputed again. But we are almost near the finish line in terms of at least, let's say, the methodologies. These are being set up, and in the next years, we might see them gradually being deployed. Now, in this session, we would like to discuss another, let's say, a new kid on the block in terms of balancing market redesign. So as you can imagine, with renewables, not only energy provision becomes very important, but also reserves. And currently what happens is that if you would end up at a moment that we're out of reserves, so we don't have enough resources to suddenly balance the system, you would have administrative curtailment. So you would suddenly see the price becoming very high, a sort of price spike. And these price spikes, they are needed in order for certain generators to make their business case. But as you can imagine, as these price spikes can be very infrequent, this might not be something that you want to rely your business case upon. So one thing to deal with this is to signal to the power market how scarce your reserves are. And as such, what you actually create is a mechanism which signals and prices that when we are near to depleting our reserves, it is more valuable to have reserves in place, and it's more valuable to be able to provide this balancing energy. And this is so-called a scarcity price function, which would make these sudden, very high price spikes into something where you would have more smooth, maybe often a bit lower price spikes, but we clearly signal at those times it's very valuable to be there because the system might need you as we might be close to depleting our reserves. So this is not something new. This has been proposed by William Hogan, who is a professor at Harvard, and it's been implemented in the US, in ERCOT, in MISO, and I think in PGM they're also talking about it. So as you can see from the graph, it means Q, if you have many reserves, around 2,000, 2,500 in this example, adding reserves to the system does not really have value. So there's no additional value to it. If you are almost near to finishing your reserve, let's say 500,000 or less than 500, suddenly the price goes up. And this is the adder, which is signaling the need for reserves and add it to your imbalance price or balancing energy price. But this is over to Anthony to describe it better. So why do we have also the Commission regulation, or let's say the clean energy package on this slide? Because this is mentioned as one of the measures that member states have to implement before thinking about a capacity mechanism, because it's said that if you would implement this, the energy market would work better and you might not need a capacity mechanism. So this is why this is also very relevant in this European context. So before going over to Anthony, who really studied this in depth and is also ongoing discussions on how to proceed in terms of this, we would like to ask you one question. And the poll would be such shortage price function in European balancing markets, which is non-existent as far as I'm concerned today, or not to the extent as we might go. Do you think that this is a good idea and we need to apply it in Europe? Do you think this is a good idea for the US but not for Europe? Or do you think that this is not a good idea because it's just another administrative intervention? What I mean by this is that you have to estimate vol, value of lost load. You have to estimate the probability that you have an outage. So in the end, there is some administrative intervention. So which one of the three options would you choose?
Thank you, Tim. And I'm very curious on the results. While you're voting, and you can also, of course, as always, put questions in the Q&A or in the chat box, and we'll pick them up during our discussion. Whoa, so we have a winner of 70% saying, yes, let's go for it. But still, some skeptics need to be convinced if we want to convince them. I do not know, Anthony, on which side are you? Go ahead, you have the floor. Don't forget to unmute. And
yeah, great. Let me do some key IT moves here. I'm gonna exploit my electrical engineering background to...
Even computer science I read, so.
Can you see something?
Yeah, go ahead, we see your slides.
Perfect. Great, so that was it. Okay. So first of all, thank you, Leonardo, for this great opportunity to talk about this very, what I consider a very interesting topic. And I was very, actually, I was surprised about the outcome of the poll. I would have voted for the first option, but I couldn't as a panelist. And part of that has to do with some of the original analysis that we did with the Belgian regulator, which started in 2014. So the question of whether this is an administrative, okay, before even talking about that, I really enjoyed reading your book, especially the part on balancing. I actually discovered a lot of insights regarding the historical evolution that brought us to this day that I wasn't aware of. So I would highly recommend this to the entire audience. It's a great read. Okay, regarding the reference to an administrative intervention, I see this as much an administrative intervention as defining a reserve requirement for a LFC area, for example, in the sense that a hard reserve requirement is also a demand curve, an ORDC or an operating reserve demand curve. It's just that it's one without elasticity. So Overall, I think it matters it can do good for the European market. And that's the first point I want to make related to the slides. We've found through numerical analysis of at least the Belgian market that it could make the difference between technologies that were unable to recover their fixed investment costs, and when introducing it and assuming proper backpropagation of the adder to forward markets, those technologies could survive in a low marginal cost environment with lots of wind and high needs for reserve capacity. And that was an interesting observation, which then led to discussions about how we could implement this in Belgium. We've talked about to what extent this is legally compatible with the electricity balancing guideline, the clean energy package, recent decisions by Acer. So that's an important issue that will need to be resolved as part of this discussion. There are, in my opinion, clear ways in which you can also align this mechanism to the Picasso and Mari platforms that Tim mentioned earlier in his introduction. And we kind of at least rationalize our own position on how this should be done in reference 4 over there. But one thing that is important to be mindful of is how you translate the first principles to EU balancing market design. So there's a discussion of should we apply this adder for BRPs or also for BSPs, and is it legally allowed to do it also for BSPs? And is that the end of the discussion? Because actually what we argue in our recommendation to the Belgian regulator is you should do it for both in order to implement the law of one price for real-time energy, but you should also introduce a mechanism for settling reserve imbalances in the same way that we have a mechanism for settling energy imbalances, so that people will then backpropagate that value to forward reserve markets. Without a real-time market for something, the forward market for that thing is nil. That's our basic argument. Just a quick overview of the developments that have taken place in Belgium. So we have conducted a number of studies for the Belgian regulator to see what this can do for demand response resources that are engaged in the mechanism and that can profit from the mechanism through their flexibility, CCGT resources, storage, and so on. And in 2018, the Belgian TSO ELIA published a report with scarcity adders based on telemetry data from 2017. In October last year, they started publishing these adders one day after the fact using balancing market data based on the formulas that we developed together, inspired by Hogan's theory. And this year, last October, in fact, ELIA published a public consultation on the implementation of the mechanism. They advocate for applying the adders only to BRPs. Like I said earlier, our position is you should also align BSP settlements apply it also to BSPs, and there should be a mechanism for settling reserve imbalances with this adder. So there's an ongoing debate there, and I'm very interested to see how the whole discussion unfolds. But things are quite encouraging in Belgium. So we've worked a lot with the Belgian regulator in this direction, and we've collaborated with the TSO to clarify many important questions that the TSO has brought up. And I'll just stop there and leave the floor for discussion subsequently. All references that are included here are mentioned in the slides, and there's more information in the website. So thank you, Leonardo. Thank you, Tim, for this great opportunity.
Thank you, Anthony. And we'll make sure the slides are also available after the event, if you agree, on the webpage, so people can consult your work, because you really have been a pioneer on this topic. We already have quite some activity in the chat and in the Q&A box. So let me just read it out to both Tim and you, Anthony, and then you can pick up the comment you prefer to react to. So we first have someone that says, maybe I'm the minority, but I still am concerned about the administrative intervention. Farzaneh, so yeah, but maybe after listening to Anthony, Farzaneh already changed the mind. Then Hans wants to know if what the experts think here of combining the scarcity signal with capacity mechanisms, like seems to be considered in Poland to do both. Does that make sense, or does one exclude the other? Because that's what Roland seems to suggest, that yes, maybe this requires a kind of administrative intervention on real-time prices, but it can avoid a capacity mechanism. So is it really avoid or is it complement? And then we have Anders asking whether that other, where is that money going to go? Is that going to go to the suppliers, or is that going to increase the revenue for TSOs? And should we be concerned of that? Then we have Peter referring to Ireland. They're also already applying something like this in Ireland. So maybe I go first to Tim and then to Anthony. Yes. You can pick up any of these points.
Okay. Yeah. So many many good questions. The one I would like to pick up is this dilemma, or it seems to be a false dilemma between capacity markets and this scarcity price function. So I don't think that it can be seen as a sort of an alternative to it, but instead it's rather something which should be in place before you can judge whether there is the need for such capacity mechanism. And therefore, I'm also very curious because many countries are applying, or at least thinking about a capacity mechanism. And if you read the clean energy package, then they will have to come up with something like this. And Anthony really shows also today and in his work that the devils are really, the devil is in the details, because whether you implement it on only imbalanced prices and energy prices. And it also links a bit to in whose pocket this money will flow. Because if you only apply it to imbalanced prices, then the ones who are being imbalanced will, I mean, it will propagate to a certain extent, but I don't know if it will really work out very well. But then the TSOs will end up with a surplus, which they will have to do something with it, I assume. If you apply it to balancing energy, then it's really the resources which are supplying that energy at the time you need it who create more revenue. And this is exactly what you want, because it's those ones that you would also support or subsidize, whatever you want to call it, with a capacity market. So in that sense, there is definitely this connection between the two. And then Christian also says, is this really the priority? Is nodal pricing not more important? I think, yeah, both debates are very, very important and are in a certain stage of evolution. And I think mixing or talking about the two topics at the same time might be even more complicated and beyond scope of today. But I think I'll let it over to Anthony.
Thanks, Tim. I've fully agreed with what you just said. I also see Paul in the audience, who was behind the detailed BRP, BSP investigation. He held a Balancing Geeks workshop in January this year, which was extremely important food for thought as far as I was concerned, because the whole question of where this applies was originating from a LinkedIn post that he made. So regarding complementarity with CRMs, I fully agree with Tim that this is a false dilemma, but it's important to be clear about something. Money that is funneled into covering capital costs for capacity through a scarcity pricing mechanism is money that closes a missing money hole. So there is a maybe misunderstanding that you're double. So there are markets in the US included, like PJM, for example, where the mechanism coexists with CRMs. But what I think is important to note is that every euro you're putting into some sort of capacity that's benefiting from scarcity pricing, that capacity will come back asking for less in a CRM. So the fact that the two coexist doesn't mean you're double paying the same capacity as far as I'm concerned. And that's a bit the notion of this as a training wheels until, you know, we mobilize demand response, because one of the benefits of the mechanism is that you do mobilize demand response and you cover you make up the missing money problem by finally introducing this demand side elasticity and lifting needs for for price caps and so on, which is an eventual future that we would like to see. But that's one important remark, I think. Regarding Irish and UK implementations, as far as I can understand, what is done there is less related to real-time telemetry measurements and real-time quantification of how stressed the system is. This is fundamentally a real-time mechanism in the sense that you're measuring this remaining reserve in real time, and these adders are computed as a function of remaining reserve in real time. So there's a price signal that jumps in real time, and it's those resources that can respond quickly when you need them and are fast enough in real time that benefit a lot. Because when you get these price jumps, what you want is a fast moving generator or a fast load that can curtail to change their real time. And that's why it's important to apply it also to BSP settlements, to respond, to relieve the system, and to get paid. And I may be wrong, but I think the UK and Irish setup, I'm not sure it is based on real-time measurements as opposed to day-ahead measurements, which in a way dilute the effect. And regarding where the money goes, so this, the way I think of it, at least as a residual mechanism for capacity imbalances, is the same cash flow. So for the BRP BSP part, it's clear that it's a cash flow from BRPs that are stressing the system to BSPs that are helping relieve the system. For the part that relates to reserve imbalances, it's the same principles that you have in a balancing capacity market. So, but the difference is that it is a residual market. So it's important to put that market in place in order to create the real-time signal that can backpropagate to a forward capacity market. But in terms of actual volumes that are settled, the deltas, I think you can expect to see the same effect that you would see in a day-ahead energy market versus an balancing market where the volumes are smaller, so the cash flows are smaller, but it's the real-time signal that is there that is important to steer the forward market prices. So I hope that provides some useful comments to the discussion, and I'll stop here to not hog the meeting.
Thank you, Anthony. And as Mathieu wrote in the chat, if there would be a mismatch between the revenues collected and the cost of reserves, that would anyway feed back into the tariffs, either an increase or a decrease of the tariffs, right? But we still have 2 minutes, so maybe you can explain how so you have the cost of reserves, right, that are made ahead of of real time, and then you have the other in real time. How do you calibrate the two? I mean, in systems like Texas, is the other exactly recovering the cost of the reserves, the capacity cost, or not necessarily?
The adder tries to be consistent with what the value of the reserve is as measured by loss of load probability, and so as long as you're aligning what you're doing with what the reserve requirements of the TSO are, you can expect to create a consistency there. Now, granted that the calibration of that demand curve depends on VOLL, it depends on the distribution of imbalances that needs to be calculated, it depends on a bunch of other important details. So, we have this discussion of correlated imbalances before or after activation. These things matter in fine-tuning it, but I think also the demand curve of a CRM requires some kind of you need to make some judgment calls. You need to decide on the demand curve of a CRM. You need to decide who's going to benefit. Is it only newly installed capacity, or is it existing capacity as well? And maybe for the one-year auctions, it should be only the newly installed, but for the 4-year auctions, it should also be the existing. So, there's plenty of judgment calls when you can't trade reliability as a good, and that's a situation we find ourselves in here. But at least you put in place something that can mobilize the demand response, that can eventually lift a lot of these concerns and get us to, as Shmuel called it, the promised land of
Which brings you back to your roots in California, right? So I think that was nice to end the first part. So let's now jump to the second part, system operation with Valerie, and then comments by Line. Go ahead, Valerie. You can share the slides to introduce the second topic. And thank you very much to Anthony and Tim.
Thank you, Tim. I hope you can see the slides. So in this event, we will also look at a second chapter of the book, which is overall on system operation and connection requirements. But here specifically in this talk, we want to focus on regional system operation. And we have looked, among others, at how the cooperation of TSOs in Europe has evolved from, let's say, the beginning mid-2000s, I would say, until today, and then also we look further in the future. But I think before we talk about system operation, we first need to talk about the system or the regional system. And they are concretely about the underlying electricity infrastructure and how this is developed. So I think in the EU, we're quite advanced in terms of using common tools like the TYNDP to develop this common infrastructure, this electric infrastructure. And if you think back on the main purposes why we even started this and why we're still doing it today, then originally the motivations were to say, okay, it can enhance security of supply, increased interconnection, and it can also help us make better use of the resources that we have. It can help us make better use of differences in generation mixes, in weather patterns, or also in load patterns, for example. And more recently, we have seen other drivers or other motivations, for example, the increased integration of renewables or electricity from renewable sources, and also CO2 mitigation. So this for Europe, and because we have a guest from the US, we will also make some references to the US system. And I think there it's a bit different, the picture. So when you look at the physical grid infrastructure, then we see that we have three main power blocks. You have the Western interconnect, the Eastern interconnect, and then the system in Texas, ERCOT. And they have either almost none or very limited intertie or interconnection capacity. So between the Western and the Eastern interconnect, it's roughly 1.3 gigawatts of intertie capacity, which is very small if you think about the size of the networks that they connect. And very recently, I think in October this year, there has been a study published by major US research labs on the value of increasing this interconnection capacity between East and West. And they have looked at certain cases, and for the cases they have looked at, they found that the benefits of interconnecting better would outweigh the costs. And if you look at the reasoning behind it, then it seems rather similar to the economic drivers for interconnection that we have seen in Europe. So they say it would enhance economic growth, and it would help to increase the efficient exploitation of resources like solar and wind, also natural gas, and it would also help balance the loads across the entire system and across the entire country. But overall, it seems, I think there's also been some resistance to this study. So overall, it seems that the interconnection issue is a bit sensitive in the US, not the least at the political stage. So I don't really know how feasible it is in terms of interconnection, what we will see there in the future. Now, if we go back to Europe, I'll try to move the slides. Yes. And when we think about how well we do in Europe in terms of operating this common infrastructure, then we have seen increased TSO cooperation over the past decades, and that in a more structured way, because we know that we've seen cooperation for roughly 100 years, but in a more structured way that emerged in 2008 as a response of the TSOs to disturbances that had happened before. So, for example, system disturbance in 2006, but also the Italian blackout in 2003. And that was because the TSOs kind of realized that there is benefit in looking beyond the national system to also know what's going on in the neighboring system and also beyond that. So we have seen kind of three steps until now, dedicated steps, I would say. One was the voluntary RSCIs that emerged in 2008. The second one was then the formalization in the context of the network codes and guidelines and the mandatory participation of TSOs in RSCs. And the latest step was with the clean energy package, this transition from RSCs into RCCs that is going to happen and that will be operational from 2022. And with this institutional or structural evolution, we've also seen a sort of increase in the importance, at least if you look at the tasks, because the clean energy package most recently defined 16 tasks for RCCs. But I think it's also important to note that the TSOs remain responsible for operational security, and the RCCs are there to provide coordinated actions or recommendations. But the TSOs have to justify if they deviate, and they can only deviate for security purposes and not for economic considerations. So this is to be kept in mind. And then when we look at the status of regional cooperation and integration in Europe and in the US today, then we see these very colorful pictures here that describe a bit where we arrived at. So when we look at power system blocks, then in Europe at the moment, we have 5 synchronous areas, but we also know that it's not a kind of fixed concept, because we will see the synchronization of the Baltics to continental Europe in a couple of years. In the US, we have 3 synchronous areas that are basically run independently from each other, whereas in Europe, you have these more interconnection between the synchronous areas. Then when we talk about system operation, we have these 6 RSCs in Europe that, as you can see, I mean, they provide services to the TSOs, but they're not necessarily aligned with other concepts like the synchronous areas. I have to say that that will also change with the RCCs, so there will be increased alignment there. In the US, you have these ISOs or RTOs that go beyond the tasks that the RSCs have in Europe. But then when you look at market integration, not necessarily at the market design or technicalities, but market integration, I guess you could say that we are more advanced in Europe, because in general, the footprint of the European electricity markets, I would say, is more pan-European, whereas in the US, the footprint of the markets is regional and matches more or less these ISOs or RTOs that we see. So I think, and to conclude, there are maybe 2 sorts of questions that emerge. So one, if we look at the US system and we consider that we might go for more interconnection in the future, whether that happens or not is then a different question. But if we do, are then these regional structures that have emerged, are they fit for purpose? And then in the EU, where we have seen that also in this evolution and in these steps, sometimes, while you could consider system operation to be a more technical issue, sometimes it also touched upon political sensitivities, especially when stakeholders felt that one step would go too far. So there, we would like to ask you how you feel about this, and whether you think that if the current level of regionalization of system operation in Europe strikes the right balance between national European interests. So basically, whether you think where we arrived is enough, this regional approach, or we think we need more Europeanized approach, or maybe even less.
Thank you, Valerie. Again, we just will wait to see the results to then kick off with the opening comments from Line. And we cannot vote, so we cannot influence you, only by talking. Okay, so here opinions are a bit more spread than in the previous question, but still 60% agree. And if I then add the strongly agree, okay, then you could say that 70% in total agree or strongly agree. While there is really on the disagree, it's not strongly, it's more a light disagreement of still significant 27%. So Line, I think you were also quite close to that topic, right? Go ahead.
Right, thank you. Yeah, so I guess, yeah, the question is, you never know what you would get if you increase it, or what you will get if you decrease it again, maybe. But yeah, so I, as has been mentioned, I am in the US. I am also very happy to be here today. You might see the sun rising in Madison through my window here. I can see it creeping across my desk here. So, but I wanted to start out and just say thank you, Leonardo and Valerie and Tim, for organizing this event. I also really appreciate being here and being able to talk to you. So while I am now sitting here in Madison, my background is, as mentioned earlier, from Europe. And in particular, I did my PhD at the ETH in Zurich in collaboration with TSC. So this was a European project that worked on understanding how to better coordinate the actions that the TSC finds in order to improve system reliability and security. So I very much sort of come from that angle into this topic. And I wanted to maybe share my screen here just for a second. And so I'm just a couple of like sort of more of the, and this is more of a, so you can see it now. Do you see my screens? Is that
yes,
right?
yes,
okay.
We can.
Great. Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of take also a step back and look at sort of the timeline for this that I found. I mean, I found your book very interesting, and I also really appreciated reading this part about regional integration and how that has come to happen. And I also really thought that, you know, the account of the cruise ship incident and the solar eclipse are very, you know, important aspects of how this has come to be what it is today. One thing I wanted to sort of point out here is that, of course, as we were talking about, if we're talking about the cruise ship, it's also very worthwhile to talk about the Italian blackout and how there was the sense in the early 2000s that, you know, these two incidents happened pretty soon after one another. And it really raised this question of, you know, how do we do regional integration in the European system? And are we doing that right? And then particularly as we are moving into this future, which is hopefully looking more renewable, there is an increase in cross-border trading. How are we going to be able to manage to avoid these kind of events happening? And I just wanted to mention that this type of event is very different in nature from the solar eclipse event that you also mentioned in your book, which is sort of looking at a more of a, you know, if you have a solar eclipse coming up, you are able to actually plan for it. You can think about what do we expect to see happening here and what are the steps that we can take in order to reduce the risk associated with such a kind of big disruption in the system. And so what I see as sort of the leading thing that is really pushing for regional integration is this fact that, you know, the difference between the solar eclipse and these other blackouts is that there was nothing special that happened on this day. No one would have said that this day is going to be the day we have a blackout. And so this means that you really need to have to be alert every single day and think about, you know, how do we integrate renewables? How do we manage cross-border trading? And that need has, over the past decade or so, really increased the need for cross-border collaboration and cross-TSO collaboration. And I think that has been, from what I see, sort of been what has been driving it. And you can think of here, I mean, I don't know how many in the audience are sort of used to thinking about or have visited or been in an operating room. But when you look at power system real-time operation, you do actually have people who sit and look at the screen. They are watching what's going on. They have a lot of tools to help them take action. But then you also, you know, they kind of have this very complex system in their head. And very often their reactions to system conditions is based on experience. Of course, they also, and I really admire that level of experience that these people who sit in this room actually have in understanding what they need to do in order to make the system safe. However, one of the challenges that now comes with renewable energy and cross-border trading is that we see a lot more different kinds of scenarios. And so the person who is sitting and watching this might now see situations that they've never seen before. And that can be a real challenge to manage to understand what to do. So that is where we really need increased data analytics. We need increased tools to help make decision-making more secure and reliable. And we also need more coordination. And the challenge here is that, you know, there is not one such person who is sitting in the operating room. There are such people sitting everywhere in Europe. And here I've just, you know, added for the TSC operating rooms a little bar everywhere. And you can think that if someone changes something in, I don't know, in Germany, say, then that is going to actually impact the whole rest of the system. And that is why coordination is so important, because if I try to solve a problem for me locally, then I might actually end up causing problems for everyone around. And so I just wanted to put up this slide here and sort of say, this is sort of this spatial extent of this. And so essentially and I will stop sharing my screen here so we can get back to talking to each other. But essentially, so the goal of coordination, as I see it, is sort of the exchange of up-to-date information about the system, making sure, and here good data management is a huge challenge. It's important that system operators have models that match so that they see the same information, which allows them to prevent mistakes. And then they also need to talk to each other. And if you talk to a system operator in Poland, he will tell you 10 years ago, I didn't know my counterpart in Germany, but I do today because I talk to them every single day. And that is where, this regional cooperation comes from, is this need to actually talk to each other more frequently. And so what I think of as like a very important aspect of the RSCs and in the future RCCs is to perform this risk and security analysis that cannot be done by a single TSO alone. And then sharing those results. And as Valerie was mentioning, there are then actions that TSOs will have to take. But there's, of course, here also this challenge between who has the decision-making power, whether they should implement those actions or not. And here there are questions about who actually, in the end, carry the responsibility for avoiding a blackout in their country. That is the TSO. And so it makes sense that they have the last resort to say yes or no. And then, of course, having these regional cooperation and agreements is very important to make sure that if a TSO is implementing a costly measure to help their neighbor, that cost gets allocated also appropriately. So that is sort of, I think, important aspects of regional coordination that needs to be addressed. I also wanted to just, and I will stop talking, but I just wanted to briefly touch on the comparison between the US and Europe. And in the US, we do have the ISOs who run nodal markets in many places, right? So we have a market structure that is much more cognizant of the congestion management in real time and tries to find a market clearing outcome that more inherently account for congestion. However, in my experience here, I am yet to see this sort of regional coordination. I think everything here seems to be very much at the bilateral bilateral agreements between ISOs and RTOs in how they deal with borders, like flows across their borders. And I actually think that if you look at things like the SEAM study, the question is not only how do you interconnect those interconnections, but how do you actually make proper use of these interconnections, right? How do you actually decide how much power you're going to trade there? And I think this is a really big challenge that we have in the US, particularly because there is a portion of the country in the middle which is very sparsely populated. So yeah, so that is, I guess, my thoughts on this.
Thank you, Line. Very interesting comments. Everyone can again raise issues in the chat. Let me already pick up one. So York is saying we all voted for, yes, we did strike the right balance with the RCCs, but what is the right balance? So I think Line already hinted to some of it, right? You seem to agree, Line, with the fact that these RCCs do not have decision-making power because the ultimate responsibility still lies with the TSO. So then the RSC giving advice sort of matches that. Also, you hinted to a European project you worked on where you already gave recommendations, right, on what could be the tasks of such an RCC. Valerie, you already mentioned one. You said the security analysis is quite important. I don't know if you were able to look at the ones you had recommended originally and the list of tasks you see now that has been given to this RCC by European legislation, right? Because Valerie was showing a quite large list. So can you say something more about that?
Yeah, so I can talk about that. So what we saw, so our project was also very strongly related to the idea of developing the tools that are needed in order to do effective risk assessment and and manage security constraints and like manage system operations. So this would be, we were kind of working on developing the tool that would run in the background at an RSC. As we ended up this project in 2016, the TSC moved ahead to try and implement it. Like that was a goal of theirs. I don't know if they did exactly probably not exactly the same thing that we implemented, but you know, that was the idea of having a tool, these kind of tools that run across all the TSOs and find the right actions across all of them. Was a strong recommendation from the project. We had run simulations where we were trying to do this, like how would you do this manually, or is it what could you accomplish with the tool? And we saw that was just like a very big saving, both in terms of the cost of the implemented measures, but also in terms of reduced overhead for coordination. Because as I said, if you change something one place, it will change everywhere. And so you have to have like multiple kind of calls and iterations where I decide to change something, then someone else has to change their plans. And so this is a really important part of this regional cooperation, and definitely something that I think has been strengthened in these new developments.
Okay, thank you, Line. Valerie, maybe I ask you to come in, because there is also a discussion in the chat on, you know, what is now really the state? Are the RCCs just giving advice, and can TSOs ignore it? Yes, no? Can you give a bit more background to that?
Yeah, thanks. So I think I wanted to try a bit to bridge a bit between what Line said and also what Jörg said in the chat on what is the right balance, or what do we understand under the right balance. And I think he kind of answered it already, but maybe just to summarize. So how I see it is, if you look at it from a European perspective, then I think the question hints to whether, how do you ensure that the European interests prevail over the national ones in terms of maybe not absolute terms, but in terms of enhancing the cooperation and reaping the benefits from that cooperation, whether it be economic, whether it be technical, whether it be the avoidance of certain incidents that we have seen. So in that sense, and I think here is especially interesting to look at what the Clean Energy Package says about the governance of the RCC. So indeed, they have to be impartial, and they have to be they are supposed to be independent of national interests and also of the interests of individual TSOs, and should complement the TSOs where this is of, I think, cross-border relevance or regional relevance. And then there is also a sort of management board for the RCCs that is composed of representatives of the TSOs. But as I understand it, this does not, let's say, have an impact on the day-to-day operations. So all these specific tasks that we showed on one slide, but it more relates to the overall budget of the RCCs and how they are structured. And I think some of the things also come back to like a general discussion on more regional or more European that you can have. And I think there are many arguments, but one also relates a bit to what Line said, I think. So one where you could say, okay, maybe regional as we have it today also has certain benefits, is indeed when you talk about these tools that are being used, because I think often a lot of what we see in Europe today is organized in some kind of region. And I think often you can say that if you go beyond the region, you might also lose a certain level of trust, because you think that a regional entity also knows very well, what the system needs, and what are the solutions targeted and addressing these specific needs in this specific region. And I think there are even cases, at least I have read about it, where the TSOs don't even want to give certain aspects of the tasks to the RSCs, because they say, okay, no, we know best our system. And even a regional entity like an RCC might not know it that well. At least this is what I have read. So I think this is one argument where you could say, okay, regional is enough. But then on the other hand, you could also say, we have European power markets, or at least we're getting there. We have one common grid model, which is basically the fundament for a lot of the tasks that the RCC do. So maybe we're also creating sort of redundancies that are not always necessary by having multiple entities running the same processes.
Thank you, Valerie. And I think Anders already made a comment that what we think today is the right balance. Already tomorrow or next month or in 2 months from now, we might want to take a next step. So I don't know if you feel comfortable to make a prediction. We won't hold you accountable for your prediction, but how do you see the power system evolving? Looking back, and if you see what we did 10 years ago was unbelievable, I think, where we are today. But going forward, do you think we will still see big changes in system operation, and why? Just as some last closing comments, Lina, go ahead.
Yeah, so for example, when you look at the map, right, I talked about TSC, there's also Coreso, for example. They are bordering each other. There is no reason why they shouldn't be collaborating maybe more closely, right? But I think that here it's also important. I think it is important that it does grow somewhat step by step, because you are really asking, people to give away responsibility, and they need to feel comfortable about that. So I would assume that we will kind of keep seeing more and more integration as we move forward in time. I would hope so. I also saw that there was a question in the chat about sort of wholesale operation and markets and how those are not very closely linked. And that is, of course, so I think that is one of the key things. So like, how does the wholesale markets develop? What market mechanisms will be there in order to enable coordination? I think that will be a really important aspect. How does the markets develop will be an important aspect of also how we do regional coordination. So yeah.
Thank you, Lina. Valerie, you would like to add something?
Yes, just very quickly, because if you read the SGL, then it says clearly that the RSCs are only a first step towards more regional coordination and integration of system operation. And I think that also relates to, again, a comment by Jörg, because we've seen, I think they were accepted, the system operation regions, and there you can also see some sort of shuffling around with the CCRs. So I think at the moment it's very interesting to see. We have capacity calculations on the one hand, and then system operation region on the other hand, and somehow they, the lines are blurred between the two. So I think it will be interesting to see where we are going. And when you look at the system operations and operation regions, then you see an area that is even greater than core CCR. So that remains, I think, interesting to see in the future.
Thank you, Valerie. And I think I will use the last minute to close. Also, some of us, all of us, basically, it's unavoidable when we have these discussions. You start to use a lot of technicalities, terms, acronyms. So I think one thing we also try to do with the book is to make that jargon a bit more accessible to a wider audience. And I just also wanted to mention, here you go. Normally you should see the slide. So to close, this doesn't have to be the end. We already mentioned the book several times, but we also have a training on the same topic we run every year. We just finished the 4th edition. We had 170 people attending, and we hope also next year many of you will join us, because what we do in the training is actually we start where the book stops, because the book stops at all the open issues, like we discussed 2 of these open issues today. And in the training, we go deeper into many of these open issues, and we try also to refer to the latest academic work by others like Lina and Anthony in that training. We also are active in a project called Interface, where we are already thinking of the next steps in electricity markets in Europe. And so we continue to produce new output on that. If you like this event and you want to know what more we have to offer, well, we run these kind of online events every Wednesday. You were part of FSR Insights now, but as you can see, we have 3 other formats that you can try out. And if you like them, you can come back every Wednesday. And I will just close by saying once more, thank you to everyone, and especially to Lina, because she woke up very early to be here with us, because where she was, it was 10 before 7 a.m. when we started. So thank you all, and especially Lina.